Hello, I'm Ross King. This is Renaissance Discoveries, and in this episode, we're going to go back in time, as usual, on this occasion to look at a big shift that occurred in Italian art in the 1400s and the way in which that great stalwart of panel painting, the altarpiece, was given a makeover. It was refashioned and refreshed. We could almost say reinvented thanks to a group of painters and designers working in Florence, not least one Filippo Brunelleschi. This is a shift that helps us track the gradual but steady progression from the Gothic art and sensibilities of the Middle Ages to what we call the Renaissance. I want us, first of all, to go back to, let's say, the year 1440 in Florence and to the beautiful Dominican Basilica of Santa Maria Novella, where we would be able to see in one of its burial chapels a magnificent work of art. It was an altarpiece commissioned some 50 or 60 years earlier, i.e., in the late 14th century, by a woman, Andreola Cavalcanti, in memory of her husband who died in 1379, only 6 years into their marriage. She hired the painter Giovanni del Biondo to do a scene of the Annunciation, that is, of the Archangel Gabriel appearing to the Virgin Mary with the news that she will conceive a son by the Holy Spirit and call him Jesus. Luckily, we can still see the work today in the Accademia in Florence in all its glory, and it certainly is glorious. It's 13 feet high and more than a dozen feet wide. In other words, absolutely massive. There are more than 60 figures, including many saints crowded together. If we want to get technical, we could say it's an anachronistic crowd scene because these people never could have grouped together on planet Earth. We have St. Paul, who died in the first century AD, between St. Benedict, who lived 400 years later, and St. Dominic, who lived 700 years after that. But of course, this crowd scene is not set on earth. It's set in heaven, where all of these saints and ecclesiastical worthies have come together and where, hopefully, we will join them. All of them occupy a complex and ornate architectural framework in which the panels are set. There's lots of gilding on the woodwork, for example, on the trim of some of the clothing. And in some ways, it's a work of carpentry as much as it is of painting. Just look at the crockets, the finials with their leaf decoration, the little Gothic arches with their tracery, in one of which we find God the Father blessing the dove of the Holy Spirit. And then in the center, we have the Annunciation itself, with the Virgin seated, having been interrupted in her reading by the arrival on her threshold of the Archangel Gabriel. Okay, after admiring this work in the Basilica, we go to another church, that of San Lorenzo, a walk of about 10 minutes. And here we see another work of art, another altarpiece, another Annunciation. This one so new in 1440 that the paint is still wet. We're not far, relatively speaking, either in time or space from Giovanni's work, but we have a very different type of painting here. The painting shows the same subject, and it was done for a similar purpose, to adorn the altar of a chapel, and it was commissioned by a wealthy patron, a man from the Martelli family. So what has happened? The elaborate carpentry is gone, the cast of hundreds is gone, the gold leaf is gone, the enormous size is gone. This one's only about 6 feet wide. All extraneous detail, all the intricate woodwork and opulent decoration have been pruned away, and we're left with this extremely vivid and compelling scene of the Annunciation. This altarpiece was painted by Filippo Lippi. Filippo painted his altarpiece in this way, not because of what he was told to do by Mr. Martelli, but according to the instructions given by the architect of the church, Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi planned for, as a means of raising extra money to build the church, some 30 private chapels, each one of which offered pious, affluent, and status-conscious Florentines the opportunity for a prestigious burial site which they could decorate with frescoes and altarpieces. However, this was not to be an artistic free-for-all, because Brunelleschi decreed in 1434 that the paintings were to be a rectangular altarpiece without gables, finials, or crockets, honorably painted. So there was to be a uniformity of shape and size, the same rectangular dimensions with no fancy Gothic carpentry. And this shape, in the decades that followed, would slowly and gradually become the standard one. This might have seemed an odd and intimidating brief in 1434, but Brunelleschi had given the artists, thanks to the use of single point perspective, and see my video on this, the ability to take the format and turn it into something exciting. I'll come back to these altarpieces, but let's look a bit at the history and development of the altarpiece as a devotional object, as a piece of what we might call the liturgical furniture, and why it had taken the shape that it did. Because altars have an interesting history. The earliest ones actually seem to have been tombs or sarcophagi, and as early as the 2nd century AD, the Christians would gather for meals and to celebrate Mass at, and sometimes on, the tombs of the martyrs. Think of graveside vigils and offerings on the Mexican Day of the Dead. And if you think about it, many altars today actually look like sarcophagi. And in fact, over the years, some ancient sarcophagi in which the bones had long ago crumbled, sarcophagus means flesh eater because the limestone from which they were made corrodes the body. Some ancient sarcophagi were turned into altars, such as this one in the Abbey Church of San Clemente a Casauria, where a 4th century sarcophagus was repurposed many centuries later as the high altar for the church. But this wasn't just a matter of recycling. Altars also functioned as sarcophagi or tombs of a sort, since many of them were constructed over the graves of saints, and increasingly they came to contain the relics of saints. In fact, a number of councils of the church, starting with one held in Carthage in 401 AD, decreed that every altar must contain a relic. Now, the altar was traditionally decorated with an altar cloth on top and on the front, the antipendium, a big word that simply means hung in front. This rectangle-shaped frontal might be a richly decorated fabric, or else it might be made from painted wood with inlays of precious stones, lending a kind of beautiful and decorative pattern to the front of the altar. Antipendia were also sometimes painted, such as this one, done as an inscription on its states in 1215 for the altar of an abbey near Siena. It's gilded and painted, showing Christ the Redeemer flanked by scenes of the legend of the true cross. Various fastening marks seem to indicate that this panel changed its position at some point, migrating from the front of the altar, which was designed for, to the top at the back. In other words, it was transformed from being an antipendium to what we now think of as an altarpiece. Now, there's an ingenious hypothesis about this and other antipendia in one of the most influential books ever written on altarpieces, one by Henk van Os, a brilliant Dutch scholar and communicator who in the 1990s had one of the best jobs in the world, director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In his book, Sienese Altarpieces, 1215 to 1460, first published in English in 1984, Van Os argued that a change in the liturgy decreed by the Lateran Council in 1215 led to the development of the altarpiece. This change involved the way in which Mass was conducted after 1215, specifically the position of the officiating priest. Traditionally, the priest stood behind the altar, facing the congregation, the position called versus populum, towards the people. But after 1215, he moved to the front of the altar and turned his back to the congregation as he celebrated Mass. This is known as ad orientem, or facing east. This meant, of course, that he blocked the antipendium. He stood in front of it. And so it was then raised to a position at the back of the altar, where it could be seen as a kind of backdrop to the elevation of the host, a ritual that developed at this point precisely because the priest had his back to the faithful. He therefore had to raise the host so it could be seen, something that was obviously unnecessary in the days when he stood on the other side of the altar facing everyone. Over the following 2 centuries, the altarpieces became ever larger and more elaborate because they were no longer constrained by the space in front of the altar. And in fact, the bigger and more visible, the better. They were often placed on predelas, in effect pedestals, to raise them even higher and make them more visible to the faithful. And hence we have developing the gargantuan, multi-gabled, cast of thousands performances, such as Giovanni del Biondo's in Santa Maria Novella. Now, like all brilliant theories, this one of Van Ossa's has come under great scrutiny. It's been reevaluated, picked apart, even rejected outright. Scholars have pointed out that there was no stroke of midnight transition from celebrating Mass behind the altar to moving in front of it, that altarpieces had existed in some churches since the 10th or 11th century, that there were no decrees regarding altarpieces in canon law, and that they were not actually necessary for the performance of the Mass. Nevertheless, it is possible to make a sweeping generalization that in the 12 and 1300s, the altarpiece replaces the Antipendium as the prime site on the altar for decoration, devotion, and storytelling, and that this change must have something to do with the orientation of the priest celebrating Mass, as well as with pious members of the congregation, like Mrs. Cavalcanti in Florence, who are affluent enough to pay for these works of art, because most of them, most altarpieces, are private commissions paid for by the faithful themselves, not by the church. Another thing that we can note is that the architecture, if we can call it that, of these altarpieces, their Gothic form, such as pinnacles, cusps, and pointed arches, matches the architecture of the churches in which we find them. Gothic churches with pointed arches have inside them altarpieces whose gables and crockets mirror, in miniature and in wood, these external appearances. So that's how we arrive at this point in the 1380s, when Giovanni does this beautiful work, which would have shimmered and glowed as the priest celebrated Mass by candlelight in the chapel, raising the host before the beautiful altarpiece. If we go to another church in Florence, the Franciscan Basilica of Santa Croce, another Gothic church, we find the Rhinocine Chapel, again funded by a wealthy and influential family. And inside, as part of the remarkable decorative ensemble, we can see another of Giovanni's altarpieces, this one still in the location for which it was painted, still on the altar for which it was commissioned. One of the wonderful things about the Rhinocine Chapel is that it's a 14th century funerary chapel which still retains its original decorations, including the wrought iron gate. We can appreciate the tremendous size of the Rhinocine altarpiece completed by Giovanni in 1379. It's 3 levels high, like the facade of a small building, and so big and heavy that it needs to be supported by these 2 octagonal buttresses that are anchored to the floor of the chapel. It really is a magnificent work, but things are going to change. The figures in the altarpiece are in some ways like the statues in the niches on the facade of a Gothic cathedral. They're separated from one another architecturally and don't occupy the same pictorial space. But in the 1400s, these figures are going to come down out of their niches and mingle together in the same space and time. This change comes about because of a change in the philosophy of picture making. I modestly refer you to my video on the Renaissance discovery perspective for more on this, about the development by Filippo Brunelleschi in the 1410s and 20s of linear perspective. I won't go into that aspect of the new painting so much here because I do it so clearly and comprehensively in the other video. But let me say this. Just a couple of years before Filippo painted his altarpiece for San Lorenzo, Leon Battista Alberti, a kind of protege of Brunelleschi, wrote a book in which he compared a painting to a view through a window, a view in which the spectator was invited to imagine the space of the painting as continuous with his or her own physical space, and with the objects and people in the painting having a tangible physical presence in the here and now. So if for the medieval altarpiece, the template might have been the facade of a cathedral with stone saints occupying their separate niches, by the 1400s, we get this idea of a painting as a view through a window. Here is Filippo Lippi again. Let's return to him. This is the Barbadore altarpiece, painted a couple of years before the one for Martelli in San Lorenzo. This was done for the Church of Santo Spirito in Florence. This work is now in the Louvre, stolen by Napoleon and never returned by the French. Fra Filippo was given the same brief as Giovanni had been decades earlier at Santa Croce. Give me a virgin and child surrounded by saints. Here, St. Augustine on the right and a chap named Fridianus on the left, an Irish saint to whom Mr. Barbadore, who commissioned the work, was devoted. But Filippo has arranged things differently than to how Giovanni went about it. The figures have come out of their separate niches and now occupy the same space, the same room, so to speak. Everyone, including Filippo Lippi himself, looking out at us as he photobombs everyone, is clustered in this rather elegant room with its classical elements such as the cornice and the balustrade. So the back of the painting has been opened up. We don't just have a gold background, we have an architectural setting and even some blue sky. Note the much simpler frame. There are three rounded arches that, in a kind of visual pun, are held up by the marble columns that Filippo has painted. These painted columns were a kind of vestige of the woodwork that divided the figures in polyptychs into their separate compartments. But Filippo plays with them because they don't actually separate Augustine and Fridianus, who are actually positioned in front of them. This is one of the very earliest examples of the single field altarpiece in which the figures are set in a continuous and unified space, in which they occupy the same space and the same time. And crucially, we seem to share that space too. The architect of Santo Spirito, where this painting was installed until Napoleon nicked it in 1810, was Filippo Brunelleschi. And he had the same plan for his chapels here that he had for San Lorenzo, that they should all be equal in size and shape, with altarpieces likewise equal in size and shape. Brunelleschi's architecture was about symmetry, proportion, ratio, harmony, with regular, elegant columns and smooth transitions, all giving a serene beauty. And this new architecture required new decorations. Brunelleschi didn't want his beautiful architectural space cluttered up with these big altarpieces, which he would have regarded as an eyesore, very much out of keeping with his aesthetic style. He would have regarded them, in fact, along the same lines as the Gothic architecture from which his own work was marking such a sharp departure. A year or two later, then, we have the altarpiece that Filippo painted for the Martelli in San Lorenzo. Likewise, a building that is concerned with symmetry, proportion, and harmony. Filippo Lippi channels Brunelleschi's architectural style in this piece, complete with round arches and the gray stone known as pietra serena, of which Brunelleschi was so fond, and which appear in both San Lorenzo and Santo Spirito. The column divides the picture in two, but the space is continuous, as evidenced by Gabriel's robe and wings protruding into the left half of the painting. If Giovanni gave a higgledy-piggledy architectural setting for the Virgin, here we have a setting that is mathematically precise, done with single-point perspective. We can trace the development of the new style of altarpiece in paintings by artists such as Fra Angelico, with his altarpiece for San Marco in Florence, or the St. Lucy altarpiece by Domenico Veneziano, done in the mid-1440s for the high altar of another church in Florence. We see that the Gothic framework of the medieval altarpieces has been transformed here into classicizing arches and niches that, crucially, do not separate the figures in either time or space. A decade or so later, Andrea Mantegna paints the San Zeno altarpiece for the Basilica in Verona. And here we see me on the right pontificating about its virtues to anyone who will listen. We do get a rather elaborate wooden framework, all gilded and painted. However, it was designed in all likelihood by Mantegna himself, and it's classical in inspiration. Look at how Mantegna plays with the framework, creating a visual pun by which he has the painted swags of flora and fruit disappearing behind the gilt columns of the wooden architecture. In other words, creating a kind of interplay or overlap between the painted and the wooden elements. But old habits die hard. People didn't just wake up one morning and realize they were living in the Renaissance and had better get with the new style. Patrons are often more conservative than the artists whom they hired to do the work for them. These patrons wanted objects of devotion for their chapels, not necessarily the kind of exciting avant-garde work of art that was going to get mentioned approvingly 500 years later in art history textbooks. Look at this beautiful work by Carlo Crivelli, finished in 1476 for a small church in what was then the tiny town of Ascoli Piceno in central Italy near the Adriatic coast, far from centers of art such as Florence or Rome. In some ways, it's an old-fashioned polyptych, but Crivelli is not simply some provincial bumpkin who doesn't know what's happening in the world of Italian art. On other occasions, he did do work in the more so-called Renaissance style. And this work, despite the traditional format, shows that he was au fait with the latest concerns. Look at St. Andrew. We see an expert handling of perspective on both the cross and the book, as well as an interest in anatomy in a feature such as the hand. But it was the new style of altarpiece, the single panel, rectangular, same space and time scene that, like the new architecture with its symmetry, proportion, and harmony, would reign supreme in the decades and then the centuries that followed. Yet another exciting and innovative visual legacy, like perspective or the use of oil paint, embraced by the artists in the 1400s who helped shape what we call the Renaissance. Thank you so much for watching. Please watch my other videos. Please subscribe. And please, if you want to know more about the art and technology of the 1400s, especially in Florence with its world-beating geniuses, I modestly urge you to do yourself the tremendous favor of reading some of my books, available in your favorite bookshop.